the smell hit them first. Not the familiar scent of old hymnal pages or polished wooden pews. Not the lingering aroma of coffee from the fellowship hall or the faint trace of Mrs. Henderson's perfume from the front row. Gasoline. It was 11:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning when Betty Kowalski tried to push open the heavy oak doors of River of Grace Church. The brass handles wouldn't budge. She pressed her shoulder against the wood, thinking maybe the humidity had warped the frame again. But when she looked down, her blood turned to ice. A thick chain wrapped around the door handles, a padlock hanging heavy and deliberate. Behind her, 237 people sat in those familiar wooden pews, completely unaware that they had just attended their final sermon. Children colored in their activity books. Elderly members dozed peacefully. Young mothers bounced babies on their hips. And at the front of the sanctuary, Pastor Elias Morton stood in a blood-red robe they had never seen before, holding something that made Betty's scream catch in her throat. A double-barrel shotgun. My beloved congregation. His voice echoed through the sanctuary. No longer the warm baritone that had comforted them for 3 years. Now it was cold, mechanical. Today we discover who truly serves the Lord and who serves mammon. The match trembled in his left hand. The gasoline-soaked rags around the altar began to smoke. Betty clawed at the doors, her fingernails splitting against the wood. Behind her, the screaming started. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. The warning signs were everywhere. For months, maybe even years, Pastor Elias Morton had been preparing for this moment. He had files on every member. He knew their sins, their bank accounts, their fears. He had turned a house of God into a death trap, and somehow, an entire community missed it. Would you have seen the warning signs? I want to know what you think. Could this have been prevented? Because by the time you hear the full story, you'll realize that tragedy doesn't happen overnight. It builds sermon by sermon, tithe by tithe, until faith becomes fanaticism and a shepherd becomes a wolf. This is a story of how one man's obsession with money and control turned a place of worship into a tomb. And before you judge those who stayed, ask yourself this. How many red flags would it take for you to question the voice you trusted with your soul? 6 months earlier, River of Grace Church had been dying a slow death for 2 years. The old pastor, Reverend William Hartley, had served faithfully for nearly 4 decades. He married their children, buried their parents, and held their hands through every crisis that touched their small town of Cedar Falls. But time catches up with everyone, and at 78, Hartley's memory began to fade like morning mist. His sermons wandered, his prayers repeated. The congregation watched their beloved shepherd struggle with words that had once flowed like honey. When Hartley finally stepped down, the sanctuary felt hollow. Attendance dropped from 300 to barely 150. The youth left for bigger churches with modern music and coffee bars. The older members whispered about selling the building and merging with First Baptist across town. That's when Elias Morton appeared. He wasn't what anyone expected. At 44, Morton was younger than most of the deacon's sons. He didn't have the silver hair and gentle smile they associated with pastoral authority. Instead, he stood 6'2" with sharp features, piercing gray eyes, and a presence that commanded attention the moment he entered a room. But when Morton stepped behind that pulpit for his trial sermon, something electric happened. "I come to you not as a polished speaker," he said, his voice carrying to the back pew without amplification, "but as a man who has wrestled with angels and demons alike. I've seen what faith can do when it's pure, and I've witnessed what happens when it's corrupted by compromise." Eleanor Vasquez, who had attended River of Grace for 32 years, would later describe that first sermon as like lightning in a bottle. Morton spoke about restoration, not just the church, but of their faith, their community, their purpose. He didn't use notes. He didn't need them. The words poured from him with a kind of conviction that made people sit forward in their seats. "This church," he declared, spreading his arms wide, "is not dying. It's sleeping. And today we wake it up." The vote was unanimous. Pastor Elias Morton would lead River of Grace Church into its next chapter. Nobody could have predicted that they had just elected their own executioner. Within 3 months, everything changed. Morton arrived early every morning and stayed late into the evening. He visited every member personally, sitting in their living rooms, drinking their coffee, learning their stories. He knew old man Patterson's arthritis flared up in the winter. He remembered that Julie Chen's daughter was starting college. He could quote the names of Lisa Murphy's grandchildren and ask about their school plays by name. More importantly, he listened. When Margaret Foster broke down crying during one visit, explaining how her husband's medical bills were drowning them, Morton didn't offer empty platitudes. He organized a church-wide fundraiser that paid off their debt in 2 weeks. When the Rodriguez family's house caught fire, Morton showed up with work gloves and helped them rebuild with his own hands. The congregation fell in love with their new pastor. Sunday attendance climbed back to 250. The youth group exploded from 8 teenagers to 43. Families that had left for other churches quietly returned. Even longtime members who had been considering other options found reasons to stay. Morton's sermons were powerful, but they weren't flashy. He preached from the heart about real struggles. Unemployment, addiction, broken families, lost faith. He made the Bible feel relevant to their Monday morning problems. He spoke their language and understood their pain. But if you knew what to look for, and tragically no one did, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. Morton's first innovation was what he called Stewardship Sundays. Once a month, instead of passing traditional offering plates, he asked members to bring their tithes directly to the altar. Let us make our gifts an act of worship, he explained, not something we hide in the shadows. It seemed innocent enough, biblical even, but while the congregation sang hymns with closed eyes, Morton watched. He memorized who gave what. He noticed who walked to the altar empty-handed. And slowly, systematically, he began keeping records. The filing system started small, just a simple notebook where he tracked attendance and prayer requests. But by his 6th month at River of Grace, Morton had created detailed files on every member of his congregation, not spiritual profiles, financial ones. Was this just strict leadership, dedicated pastoral care, or the first glimpse of something darker? Patricia Tate, Morton's administrative assistant, would later tell investigators about the late nights, how she'd arrive at the church the next morning to find the lights still on in his office, how stacks of bank statements and employment records would mysteriously appear on his desk, how he'd mutter names under his breath while organizing manila folders into neat rows. I thought he was just being thorough, Patricia would say through tears during her testimony. I thought he cared about knowing his flock. Morton's second innovation was more subtle, but just as telling. He began ending his sermons with a specific phrase: God sees the heart, but he also sees the wallet. At first, people chuckled. It seemed like a clever way to encourage generosity. But Morton wasn't joking. Every Sunday, as the congregation filed out of the sanctuary, he positioned himself at the door with his handwritten mental notes fresh in his mind. His handshakes were warmer for the generous givers. His smiles were brighter for the faithful tithers. And for those who gave less than he expected, the handshake was brief. The smile was thin. The eye contact lasted just a moment too long. Tommy Brennan, a construction worker who attended with his wife and 2 young daughters, noticed the change first. Pastor Morton used to ask about my job. You know, how the crew was doing if we were staying busy. But after I had to skip a few Sundays because of overtime work, he barely acknowledged me. It was like I'd done something wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. By his first anniversary at River of Grace, Morton had transformed a dying church into a thriving congregation. The budget was balanced. The building repairs were completed. The youth program was the envy of every church in the county. But behind his office door, Pastor Elias Morton was building something else entirely. A system of surveillance, judgment, and control that would turn faith into fear and worship into something far more dangerous. The congregation celebrated their pastor's success, never realizing they were applauding the architect of their own destruction. And this was just the beginning. 9 months into Morton's ministry, the transformation began with a failed fundraiser, but the seeds were planted much earlier. Kenneth Morrison had been serving as head deacon at River of Grace for 12 years when Morton arrived. A quiet man who owned the local hardware store, Morrison prided himself on being able to read people. It came with territory. You learned to spot the customers who paid their bills on time and those who made excuses. But Pastor Morton puzzled him. There was something about the way he looked at us during offering time. Morrison would later explain to investigators, like he was calculating something in his head. At first, I thought it was gratitude, appreciating the generosity. But the longer I watched, the more it felt like accounting. Morrison's concerns grew when Morton announced his vision for the church's future. It was a Wednesday night in October, exactly 10 months after Morton's arrival, when everything changed. The vision came, Morton claimed, during his morning prayers. God had spoken to him about River of Grace's destiny, not just as a local church, but as a beacon that would draw believers from across the entire region. The plan was ambitious. A new youth center with a full gymnasium, an expanded fellowship hall that could host community events, a modern children's wing with dedicated classrooms, and a coffee shop in the lobby that would welcome visitors 7 days a week. "This is not my dream," Morton declared from the pulpit, his voice rising with each word. "This is God's blueprint for our future. He has shown me what River of Grace can become, and I refuse to let fear or doubt steal what He has promised us." The initial excitement was palpable. Members turned to each other with bright eyes and whispered amens. The children clapped. The teenagers cheered. Even the skeptical deacons found themselves caught up in enthusiasm. But then came the number, $100,000 in 30 days. The silence that followed was deafening. Morton seemed to take the shocked quiet as a challenge. His tone shifted, becoming sharper, more urgent. "I see the doubt in your faces. I hear the whispers of impossible. But let me ask you this. Is anything impossible for God? Did He not part the Red Sea? Did He not feed 5,000 with a boy's lunch? Did He not raise the dead?" He began pacing the platform like a caged animal, his gray eyes scanning the congregation with laser focus. "This church has been blessed beyond measure. I see the cars in your driveways. I know the jobs you work. I know the abundance God has placed in your hands. The question is not whether you can give. The question is whether you trust." Rhonda Jefferson, a single mother who worked double shifts at the diner to support her 3 kids, felt her stomach drop. She had been giving $20 each week, a sacrifice that meant her family sometimes went without extras like new shoes or birthday parties. Morton's words felt like an accusation directed straight at her. Pastor Morton knew our financial situations, Jefferson would tell the grand jury. He'd visited our homes, seen our furniture, looked in our fridges. When he talked about abundance, he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what each of us could theoretically give, and he expected all of it. The fundraising campaign launched the next Sunday with military precision. Morton had created a massive thermometer-style chart that dominated the left wall of the sanctuary. Each Sunday, the red line would creep upward as donations poured in, showing the congregation's progress toward their goal. But Morton had also created something else, a private spreadsheet that tracked individual giving down to the penny. Patricia Tate, still unaware of the danger brewing in her boss's mind, helped maintain the records. He wanted to send personal thank you notes, she explained to police. He'd have me print out reports showing who gave what, and then he'd spend hours in his office writing letters. I thought it was sweet, pastoral care at its finest. What Patricia didn't see were the other lists Morton was creating. Names divided into categories: faithful servants, lukewarm believers, and robbers of God. Each category was color-coded, green, yellow, and red, like a spiritual credit report that only Morton could see. As the weeks passed and the fundraiser struggled, Morton's sermons took on a darker tone. The gentle pastor who had comforted their sorrows and celebrated their joys was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, angrier, more demanding. Stewardship is not about convenience, he preached 3 weeks into the campaign, his voice echoing off the sanctuary walls. It's not about giving what feels comfortable. True faith requires sacrifice that makes you uncomfortable, that stretches you beyond what seems reasonable. He began calling out specific behaviors without naming names, but everyone knew who he meant. The family that took a vacation during the campaign, the member who bought a new truck, the couple who chose to pay for their daughter's wedding instead of increasing their pledge. God sees everything, Morton declared, his eyes moving deliberately across the congregation. He sees the luxury purchases made while his house remains unfinished. He sees the dinners at expensive restaurants while his work goes unfunded. He sees the priority lists that put personal comfort above eternal purpose. Attendance began to drop. Some families found excuses to visit relatives on Sundays. Others discovered sudden interest in the contemporary service at First Baptist. A few simply stopped coming altogether, hoping their absence would speak louder than any confrontation. But Morton noticed every empty pew, every missing face, every family that chose to worship elsewhere. And he remembered. The breaking point came on the final Sunday of the campaign. The thermometer chart showed $12,847 raised, less than 13% of the goal. Morton stood before his diminished congregation, maybe 200 people instead of the usual 250. And the mask finally slipped. $12,000, he said, his voice deadly quiet. $12,000. He walked to the chart and stared at the barely visible red line for a long moment. When he turned back to face the congregation, his expression was something none of them had ever seen before. Not disappointment, not frustration, rage. "I have been in your homes," he continued, each word measured and deliberate. "I have sat at your tables, blessed your meals, prayed over your sick children. I have given you 3 years of my life, and you have given me your table scraps." The sanctuary was dead silent. Children sensed the tension and pressed closer to their parents. Elderly members clutched their purses tighter. Even the babies seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong. "But this is not about me," Morton said, beginning to pace again. "This is about your relationship with the Almighty. This is about what you value more than God's kingdom. This is about the choice you make between temporal comfort and eternal reward." Then he said something that made Kenneth Morrison reach for his wife's hand. "I know what each of you can afford to give. I know your salaries, your savings accounts, your spending habits. I know because a good shepherd knows his sheep. And what I've learned is that some of you are not sheep at all. Some of you are goats wearing sheep's clothing, pretending to worship while you rob God of what belongs to him." The sermon ended without a benediction. Morton simply walked off the platform and disappeared into his office, leaving 200 stunned people sitting in confused silence. That afternoon, Patricia Tate received a text message from her pastor. "Don't come in this week. I need time to pray and seek God's direction." She thought he needed space to process the fundraiser's failure. She was wrong. Pastor Elias Morton was planning something that would ensure his congregation never disappointed him again. And this was the moment some say the congregation should have walked away. But they didn't. If this story already has you shaken, don't scroll past it. Subscribe right now, because the truth is tragedies like this are repeated when people look away. Don't look away. What happened next would transform a troubled pastor into a full-blown monster and turn a house of worship into a carefully planned execution chamber. Because Morton's obsession with money was just the surface. Underneath lay something far more dangerous. A man who believed he had the right to judge not just the faith of his congregation, but their very right to exist. The true horror was just beginning. 2 months after the failed fundraiser, Patricia Tate should have been the first to notice the changes. But by then, Pastor Morton had made sure she wouldn't be coming to the office anymore. "Take a sabbatical," he had told her over the phone. 3 days after that final, devastating Sunday. "The church needs to restructure our approach to ministry. I'll handle the administrative duties myself for a while." Patricia protested. She needed the income, and besides, the church had never been busier with correspondence and scheduling. But Morton was firm. "God is calling me to a season of solitude," he said. "I need to hear his voice without distraction." What Patricia didn't know was that Morton couldn't risk having witnesses to what he was planning. Alone in the church building from dawn until well past midnight, Morton began the most important project of his ministry. Not sermon preparation, not pastoral care, not prayer and meditation. He was preparing for Judgment Day. The filing system expanded from simple financial records to comprehensive dossiers on every member of River of Grace. Morton knew that Margaret Foster's husband was cheating on her. He'd seen the man with another woman at a restaurant in the next town. He knew that teenager Billy Caldwell was struggling with alcohol. He'd found empty bottles behind the church after youth group meetings. He knew that elderly Henry Schmidt had been lying about his war service. A few phone calls to the VA had confirmed that Schmidt never saw combat. But most importantly, Murd3r had calculated exactly how much each member should have been able to give to the building fund, based on their income, expenses, and lifestyle. The families who fell short weren't just disappointing him anymore. They were stealing from God, and thieves, according to Murd3r's increasingly twisted interpretation of Scripture, deserved death. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came from Jake Rodriguez, who worked part-time as the church maintenance supervisor. He'd been repairing a broken window in the fellowship hall when he noticed something odd in the storage closet. There had to be 12 or 15 red gasoline cans lined up against the wall, Rodriguez told investigators later. All brand new, still had the price tags on them. When I asked Pastor Murd3r about it, he said we needed them for the lawn mowers and equipment, but we only had 2 lawn mowers, and they barely used a gallon of gas per month. Rodriguez was also the one who found the robe. It was hanging in Murd3r's office closet, covered by a plastic dry cleaner's bag, deep crimson red, made of heavy fabric that looked more like a medieval monk's habit than anything Rodriguez had ever seen a pastor wear. When he asked Murd3r about it, the pastor's explanation was brief and unsettling. "It's for a special service I'm planning," Murd3r said, not looking up from the papers scattered across his desk. "A service about judgment and purification." But Rodriguez noticed something else in that closet that made his blood run cold. A double-barrel shotgun, standing in the corner behind a stack of old hymnals. "Pastor Murd3r," Rodriguez said carefully, "is that gun registered with the church insurance? We have kids in the building all the time." Murd3r finally looked up, and Rodriguez would never forget the expression in those gray eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment at being caught with an undisclosed weapon. Something much worse. "Jake," Murd3r said softly, "there are wolves among the sheep. A good shepherd has to be prepared to protect his flock, even if that protection comes at a price the sheep don't understand yet." Rodriguez quit the next day. Meanwhile, the congregation was dealing with their own confusion and guilt about the failed fundraiser. Many members genuinely believed they had let their pastor down, that their lack of faith had somehow disappointed God. They began increasing their regular tithes, hoping to make amends. Others started leaving quietly. The Henderson family transferred their membership to First Baptist. The Kowalskis began attending the Catholic Church across town. The youth group, once Murd3r's pride and joy, dwindled from 43 teenagers to barely a dozen. But Murd3r was no longer focused on keeping members. He was focused on the ones who stayed, the ones who would be present for his final sermon. And what he was planning for them would make his financial obsession look like a minor character flaw. Linda Morrison, Kenneth's wife and the church treasurer, began noticing discrepancies in the monthly financial reports. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $50 there, but always from the general fund that covered utilities, maintenance, and supplies. When I asked Pastor Murd3r about the withdrawals, Linda testified later, he got very defensive, said he was making purchases for the church that I didn't need to worry about. When I insisted on seeing receipts, it was my job as treasurer, after all. He told me my term was up early. Just like that, I was replaced. Murd3r's new treasurer was Eddie Kramer, a soft-spoken man who worked at the bank and rarely questioned authority. More importantly, Kramer was one of the few members who had given generously during the failed fundraiser, earning him a place in Murd3r's faithful servants category. With Kramer handling the books without questions, Murd3r had unlimited access to church funds. The gasoline purchases accelerated. So did other items, industrial strength chains, heavy-duty padlocks, and what the hardware store receipt described as rope and binding materials. Kenneth Morrison tried one last intervention, 3 weeks before the fire. He requested a meeting with Murd3r to discuss the concerning changes in the pastor's behavior. Murd3r agreed to meet, but when Morrison arrived at the church office, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. All the walls were covered with papers. Morrison told the grand jury. Financial records, bank statements, photos of members' homes and cars. But what really scared me were the lists. Names written in different colored inks. Some crossed out entirely. Others circled multiple times. Murd3r noticed Morrison staring at the walls and calmly began taking down the papers, as if organizing a messy desk rather than concealing evidence of months-long surveillance. "Kenneth," Murd3r said, his voice eerily calm, "I appreciate your concern for the church, but God has shown me things about this congregation that would shock you. the people you think are faithful believers. Some of them are wolves in sheep's clothing. Morrison tried to reason with him. He talked about forgiveness, about grace, about the pastoral calling to love rather than judge. Morton listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his gray eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "You're right about grace," Morton finally said. "But grace only comes after judgment, and Judgment Day is coming sooner than you think." Morrison left that meeting knowing he should call the police, should contact the denominational headquarters, should do something to stop whatever Morton was planning. But what could he report? That his pastor was behaving strangely? That he'd collected financial information on church members? That he owned a gun and some gasoline cans? None of it was technically illegal. And Morrison, like so many others, couldn't imagine that their spiritual leader was capable of mass murder. It was a fatal mistake that would cost 83 people their lives. The final piece of Morton's plan fell into place 1 week before the fire. He announced during Sunday service that he would be preaching a special sermon the following week, a message about stewardship, faithfulness, and the cost of true discipleship. This will be a service like no other, Morton promised from the pulpit, wearing his familiar black robe and pastoral smile. "I encourage every member to make plans to attend. What I'm going to share with you will change everything you think you know about faith, generosity, and commitment to God's kingdom." The announcement generated excitement among the congregation. After months of tension and uncomfortable sermons about money, many members hoped this special service would mark a return to the inspiring leadership that had first drawn them to Morton. Betty Kowalski later told investigators that she almost didn't attend that final Sunday. Her family had been visiting other churches, and her husband thought they should skip River of Grace entirely. But something about Morton's announcement intrigued her. "He seemed like his old self again," she said. "Confident but not angry. Purposeful but not scary. I thought maybe he'd worked through whatever had been bothering him since the fundraiser." She was tragically wrong. On Saturday night, Morton made his final preparations. He positioned the gasoline can strategically around the sanctuary, hidden behind potted plants and beneath choir risers. He tested the chains and locks on every exit door. He loaded the shotgun and placed it in the supply closet behind the altar, covered by choir robes. And he practiced his final sermon one last time, standing alone in the sanctuary at 2 a.m., delivering his message of judgment and purification to empty pews that would soon be filled with his unsuspecting congregation. Think about it. The people in that church ignored the red flags until it was too late. Don't make the same mistake. Subscribe right now and make sure stories like this never get buried. The stage was set. The trap was prepared. And in less than 12 hours, Pastor Elias Morton would discover whether his congregation was truly willing to pay the ultimate price for their faith. What came next would prove that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and drama. Sometimes it wears a clerical collar and speaks in Bible verses, hiding behind the trust we place in those who claim to speak for God. Sunday morning, 11:15 a.m. The weather was perfect for worship. Crisp October air, golden sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, just enough of a breeze to rustle the orange and red leaves in the parking lot. It was the kind of morning that made people grateful to be alive, grateful to be gathered together in the presence of something greater than themselves. Betty Kowalski arrived early, as was her habit, to help arrange flowers and greet visitors. She noticed that Pastor Morton's car was already in the parking lot, though she couldn't see any lights on in the building. She also noticed something else. There were no ushers setting up their stations at the doors. That was unusual, she would tell investigators later. "We always had 4 ushers, Mr. Patterson at the main entrance, the Rodriguez boys at the side doors, and Mrs. Chen managing the flow in the narthex. But that morning, nobody was there. Inside, the sanctuary looked normal. The familiar wooden pews arranged in neat rows. The altar decorated with fall flowers. The choir loft ready for the morning's special music. But Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Maybe it was the smell, not the usual blend of furniture polish and old hymnals, but something sharper, more chemical. Or maybe it was the unusual quiet. Even when the building was empty, it typically carried the sounds of the heating system, the settling of old wood, the distant hum of traffic. This morning, River of Grace Church was silent as a tomb. By 11:30, the congregation had filled the sanctuary. Not completely. Attendance had been dropping steadily since the failed fundraiser, but enough to create the warm, communal atmosphere that made Sunday worship feel special. Families spread across the pews, children colored in their activity books, teenagers texted on their phones when they thought their parents weren't looking. 237 people, ranging in age from 6-month-old Emma Rodriguez to 91-year-old Florence Mitchell. They represented 3 generations of faith, decades of shared memories, countless baptisms and weddings and funerals that had woven their lives together in this sacred space. None of them noticed when the last few stragglers entered the sanctuary and quietly moved toward the doors. They were about to discover that their morning prayers had been answered by something far more sinister than they could have imagined. At exactly 11:45, Pastor Elias Morton emerged from his office. But the man who walked toward the pulpit was not the pastor they remembered. Gone was the familiar black robe, replaced by something that made several people gasp audibly. Deep crimson red, the color of fresh blood, made from heavy fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The robe was too long, dragging slightly as he walked, and too wide, giving Morton the appearance of a medieval monk or an executioner from another century. "Good morning, my beloved congregation," Morton said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary despite the absence of his usual wireless microphone. "Thank you for joining me on this most important Sunday in the history of River of Grace Church." A few people clapped uncertainly. Most just stared, trying to process the dramatic change in their pastor's appearance. Morton opened his Bible, but instead of announcing a text, he began walking slowly across the platform, his gray eyes scanning the congregation with systematic precision. He seemed to be looking for specific faces, checking off names on an invisible list. "For 3 years," he continued, "I have shepherded this flock. I have fed you spiritual milk when you needed nourishment. I have offered you grace when you deserved judgment. I have loved you even when you proved yourselves unworthy of that love." The temperature in the sanctuary seemed to drop 10 degrees. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. Elderly members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But today," Morton said, his voice rising slightly, "the time for mercy has ended. Today, we separate the wheat from the chaff. Today, we discover who among you truly serves the Lord and who serves mammon." That's when Betty Kowalski decided she needed some fresh air. She stood quietly, trying not to disrupt the service, and made her way toward the main entrance. Behind her, Morton's voice continued its strange, threatening sermon, but she was no longer listening. Something was wrong, not just with the pastor, but with the entire atmosphere of the building. The brass door handles were ice cold under her palms. She pushed, expecting the familiar resistance of heavy oak doors. But they didn't budge, not even a little. She tried again, putting her shoulder into it, thinking maybe the humidity had warped the frame. Nothing. The doors were solid as stone. That's when she looked down and saw the chain. Heavy steel links wrapped multiple times around both door handles, secured with a padlock the size of her fist. The chain was new. She could see the price tag still attached, and the lock looked industrial strength, the kind used to secure construction equipment or storage facilities. Betty's hands began to shake as the implications hit her. She tried the side doors, the same chains, the same locks. Every exit was sealed. When she turned back toward the sanctuary, Pastor Morton was staring directly at her. "Sister Betty seems to be having trouble with our doors this morning," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made every person in the building freeze. "That's because I've made sure that no one leaves until our service is complete." A murmur of confusion rippled through the congregation. Some people chuckled nervously, thinking this was part of some elaborate illustration. Others began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Morton stepped down from the platform and walked slowly toward the supply closet behind the altar. When he emerged, he was carrying something that made several people scream. A double-barrel shotgun, polished and loaded, cradled in his arms like a newborn baby. "My beloved congregation," Morton said, his voice now completely calm, almost gentle, "it's time for you to understand why you're here." Chaos erupted in the sanctuary. People jumped to their feet, shouting, crying, demanding explanations. Parents grabbed their children and ran toward the exits. only to find what Betty had discovered. They were trapped. Completely and deliberately trapped. "Please sit down," Morton said, not raising his voice but somehow making himself heard above the panic. "If you run toward the doors again, I will be forced to use this weapon, and I don't want to hurt anyone unnecessarily." Most people obeyed, too shocked to do anything else. But a few continued to test the exits, clawing at the chains, pounding on the windows, screaming for help that wouldn't come. Morton waited patiently for the noise to die down, then continued his sermon as if nothing had happened. "For months I've been watching you, learning about your true priorities, discovering what you really worship when you think no one is looking." He began walking through the aisles, the shotgun never wavering from position where it could cover the entire sanctuary. People pressed back against the pews as he passed, as if his mere presence carried some kind of infection. "Margaret Foster," he said, stopping beside a woman in the third row who was clutching her husband's arm. "Did you think I didn't know about the savings account? The $47,000 you kept hidden while claiming you could only afford $20 a week for God's work." Margaret's face went white. Her husband stared at her in shock. He hadn't known about the account either. "Tommy Brennan," Morton continued, moving to another section of the sanctuary. "Missing church for overtime pay. Choosing money over worship. Choosing mammon over the Almighty." Tommy stood up, his construction workers framed tense with anger. "Pastor, you're sick. Let these people go. If you want to talk to me about missing church, fine, but these families don't deserve." The shotgun blast cut him off mid-sentence. Morton hadn't aimed at Tommy. The blast shattered a stained glass window above the choir loft. But the message was clear. Anyone who challenged him would be next. The children were crying now, full-throated, terrified sobs that echoed off the walls like a Greek chorus of innocence facing evil. Their parents held them close, whispering reassurances they didn't believe themselves. "I'm not here to hurt the righteous," Morton said, reloading the shotgun with practiced efficiency. "I'm here to separate the saved from the damned, to divide the faithful from the fraudulent, to show you what happens when people rob God of what belongs to him." That's when the smell of gasoline became unmistakable. Morton had moved to the altar area, where several red gas cans were now visible behind the flower arrangements. As the congregation watched in growing horror, he began pouring gasoline across the platform, down the center aisle, around the perimeter of the sanctuary. "Pastor Morton," Kenneth Morrison said, standing slowly from his front row seat. His voice was steady despite the terror in his eyes. "This isn't what God wants. This isn't justice, it's murder." Morton paused in his gasoline pouring and looked at Morrison with something almost resembling affection. "Kenneth, my most faithful deacon, do you know why you're still alive right now?" Morrison didn't answer. He was calculating distances, how far to the nearest exit, how many steps to reach Morton, whether he could tackle the pastor before the shotgun discharged again. "You're alive because you gave generously during the fundraiser," Morton continued. "You and Linda sacrificed. You showed faith when others showed greed. But even you don't understand what we're really doing here. We're not doing anything," Morrison said firmly. "You're holding innocent people hostage. You're terrorizing children. This is evil, Elias. Pure evil." Morton's expression hardened. Evil is stealing from God while pretending to worship him. Evil is driving luxury cars while the Lord's house goes unrepaired. Evil is choosing vacation trips over kingdom building. He resumed pouring gasoline, the fumes now so strong that several people began coughing. The chemical smell mixed with the metallic scent of fear-induced sweat, and the sound of children crying created an atmosphere of pure nightmare. "But here's what you don't understand, Kenneth," Morton said, completing his circle around the sanctuary. "I'm not the villain in this story. I'm the angel of judgment. I'm the one God has chosen to separate the wheat from the chaff." He pulled a book of matches from his robe pocket. "Those of you who gave faithfully during the fundraiser, who showed true dedication to God's work, your names are written in the book of life. You'll be spared. You'll walk out of here as witnesses to what happens to those who rob the Almighty." Several people looked around desperately, trying to remember how much they had contributed, wondering if their donations had been enough to buy their lives. "But those of you who held back," Morton continued, his voice rising to a fever pitch, "those of you who chose your own comfort over God's glory, Today you pay the price for your selfishness. That's when Linda Morrison did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She stood up and pointed at Margaret Foster. "She's the one," Linda shouted, desperation making her voice shrill. "Margaret's the one who had the secret savings account. She could have funded the whole project herself." Morton smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. "Thank you, Linda. I knew I could count on your honesty." But instead of moving toward Margaret, Morton struck the match. "You see, my faithful congregation," he said, holding the tiny flame like a torch. "There's something I haven't told you yet, something that makes this whole situation much simpler." The flame danced in his gray eyes, reflecting like pinpricks of hell. "I don't care who gave what anymore. I don't care about your bank accounts or your faithful attendance or your prayers or your promises. Because I've learned something about God that you're all too weak to understand." He began walking toward the gasoline-soaked altar. "God doesn't want your money. God wants your souls. All of them. Every single one. And the only way to purify a soul is through fire." The realization hit the congregation like a physical blow. There were no categories. No saved and damned. No wheat and chaff. Morton intended to kill everyone. The stampede toward the doors resumed with renewed desperation. People threw their bodies against the chains, trying to break the links through sheer force. Others attacked the windows with hymnals and purses, trying to shatter glass thick enough to withstand decades of weather. Tommy Brennan, the construction worker, organized a group of men to rush Morton simultaneously. "On three," he whispered to the others. "We can overpower him if we all move at once." But Morton had anticipated this. He fired the second barrel of the shotgun into the ceiling, sending chunks of plaster raining down on the congregation. "Sit down," he screamed, no longer maintaining his pastoral composure. "Sit down and accept your judgment like the sheep you've always been." Most people obeyed, but Tommy and three other men continued their advance. They had maybe 15 feet to cover, close enough to tackle Morton before he could reload, if they moved fast enough. Morton dropped the shotgun and held the match closer to the gasoline. "One more step," he said quietly, "and I drop this match right now. Everyone dies in the next 30 seconds instead of having time to make peace with God." The men froze. For a moment, the sanctuary was completely silent except for the sound of 237 people breathing in gasoline fumes and pure terror. Children clung to their parents. Elderly members clutched their hearts. Everyone waited to see what their pastor, their spiritual leader, their trusted shepherd, would do next. Morton used the silence to deliver the final portion of his sermon. "I want you to understand something in these last moments," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "This isn't happening because I'm crazy. This isn't happening because I'm evil. This is happening because you forced me to choose between your comfort and God's glory, and I chose God." He held up the match, now burned down nearly to his fingers. "Every dollar you spent on yourselves instead of his kingdom. Every Sunday you missed for your own convenience. Every time you chose the temporal over the eternal. This is the price of that selfishness." Outside, someone had finally noticed the commotion. A passing jogger had heard the screaming and called 911. Police sirens were beginning to wail in the distance, still too far away to matter. Morton heard them too. "It seems our service is about to be interrupted," he said with genuine regret. "I had hoped we'd have more time for prayer and reflection, but God's timing is perfect, even when we don't understand it." He knelt beside the gasoline-soaked altar and began to lower the match. That's when Betty Kowalski did something that saved dozens of lives. She had been quietly working on one of the window latches while Morton was focused on his sermon. The window was old, installed in the 1960s, and the locking mechanism had been painted over so many times that it barely functioned. With her fingernails bleeding and her hands shaking, she finally managed to work it loose. The window opened with a crash that made everyone in the sanctuary turn toward the sound. "The window!" she screamed. "The window's open." Chaos erupted again, but this time with a purpose. Parents began lifting children through the opening. Smaller adults squeezed to themselves. Others formed human chains to help the elderly and disabled escape. Morton watched the exodus with something that looked like disappointment rather than anger. "You can run," he said sadly, "but you can't escape judgment. What happens here today will follow you forever. You'll remember this moment every time you hold back from God, every time you choose comfort over commitment." The police sirens were getting closer. Morton could see flashing lights through the stained glass windows. About half the congregation had managed to escape through the window when Morton finally dropped the match. The gasoline ignited with a whoosh that sucked all the oxygen out of the sanctuary. Flames raced along the trails Morton had poured, creating a pattern of fire that looked almost artistic, like some hellish design meant to showcase his twisted vision of divine judgment. People still inside screamed and pressed toward the window opening, but the flames were moving faster than they could climb through. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Morton stood in the center of the inferno, his crimson robe beginning to smolder, and smiled. The police burst through the main doors just as the first section of ceiling collapsed. They had bolt cutters for the chains, axes for the wood, and paramedics standing by for the survivors. But they were too late to save everyone. You've come this far, and most people would have clicked away. That makes you different. Prove it. Hit subscribe and share the story, because silence is exactly what allowed this to happen. When the smoke cleared and the flames died down, investigators found the bodies of 83 people who couldn't escape in time. The survivors, 154 people who made it through Betty Kowalski's window, were treated for smoke inhalation, burns, and psychological trauma that would last the rest of their lives. Pastor Elias Morton was found in the ruins of his pulpit, burned beyond recognition, but still clutching the empty book of matches that had started it all. What happened in that church wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of the most sacred trust humans can place in another person. And the most terrifying part? It could happen again, anywhere. To anyone who chooses blind faith over healthy skepticism. Because here's the truth they don't want you to know. Predators don't just hunt in dark alleys and online chat rooms. They hunt in places where people gather with open hearts and lower defenses. They wear respected uniforms, speak trusted words, and hide behind institutions that demand reverence instead of accountability. The fire at River of Grace didn't just consume wood and brick. It consumed trust. And the question lingers. How many warning signs have we already ignored? In our own communities, in our own lives? So I'm asking you directly. What would you have done if you were inside those locked doors? Would you have noticed the gasoline cans appearing week by week? Would you have questioned the filing system, the late-night office lights, the shift from grace to greed? Or would you have been like the majority, trusting, faithful, loyal right up until the moment someone you respected tried to murder you for it? Tell me in the comments, because the survivors of River of Grace want to know. Are you the type of person who would have spoken up when something felt wrong? Or would you have been another name on Elias Morton's list? Don't just watch this story and move on. Make sure it matters. Subscribe, share it, talk about it. Because silence is exactly what monsters like Morton count on to do their work. The people who died in that sanctuary trusted when they should have questioned. Don't make the same mistake.